It's the third highest peak in all of the park. And I was really excited the first morning when I got up and went out to the balcony to have some time of devotion and prayer, and I looked, and you could see the mist, or the smoke as they call it, coming up from the valleys in front of the mountain peaks. So I went in and grabbed the kids when they woke up, and I said, hey, I want to show you why they call this the Smoky Mountains. And I explained, that the Native Americans had a word for that really means smoke or blue mist. And I told the kids how it works, and the mist kind of covered the peak of Mount LeConte. You could vaguely make out the shape of the mountain. You knew it was there, but it was hidden just a little bit. We had a couple beautiful days that was sunny and 80 degrees, and on those days you could see the mountain in all of its splendor and all of its beauty with the fall colors. And then we had a couple days later where the remnant of Hurricane Zeta came through, and it was just so cloudy you couldn't even tell that the mountain was there. I mean, if you had never visited there before, you would have never known that peak was there. It was just completely covered. But just because it was covered didn't mean that it didn't exist, right? So I want to ask you this morning, how many of you have ever experienced a time or a season in your life when God's presence just did not seem to be there? Maybe you were going through a difficult season in life. Maybe you were struggling. Maybe you were suffering, and God's presence just wasn't readily available, or as much as you'd hoped it to be. I'll be honest with you, I've had those times in my own life where, I've asked God, where are you? I don't feel you. I mean, I know you're there, but you just don't seem to be there. Apologists and preachers, I guess I should say apologists and preachers who have some type of formal education, they come to understand this concept by the phrase, it's a Latin phrase called Deus obscunditus, which means the obscurity or the hiddenness of God. My experience with this, the hiddenness of God, is interesting because during the season when I feel like God is absent, it's difficult. But having lived through the moment and looking back, I often see the fingerprints of God all over it. So during that struggle, it's like, man, God, I just don't see you. I don't know if you're there. But when I get through it and I get to the other side and I look back and I see, okay, God, I know you were there the whole time. I can't deny it. When we think about where we're at in our lives currently, in our present situation, I think we're certainly experiencing a time in which some of us may be questioning the presence of God. I spent some time with a friend last night, and we both made the comment, when we were in high school, we never would have dreamed we would have lived through a pandemic like this. Whether you want to admit to the reality of this or not, it doesn't seem like the pandemic's going to be going away anytime soon. What's happened as a result is life as we had known it for many, many, many years has changed far more rapidly than we're comfortable with. On top of that, there's so many competing narratives about this pandemic. You don't know what's true, what's false, what's close to true. On top of that, you have the political issues that are going on. You have racial tensions that seem to be heightening. And there's a list of moral and ethical dilemmas that this society is facing, and it's becoming a little bit overwhelming. And I think it's in those moments when all of these things kind of come together and we experience them at once, it's in those moments that we have a tendency to question God's presence or question what He's really doing in those situations. Today, we're going to take a look at the book of Esther. And I'll just be honest with you. I'm stepping out of my comfort zone because I like to preach expositorily, where I take sections or verses at a time and go into detail. I'm going to attempt to go through the entire book this morning. And Barbara's like, Sean, you are absolutely nuts. Well, I said, yeah, you're probably right. But the reason being is because I don't think the book of Esther lends itself to being divided up. It tells a solid story that has to be looked at in its entirety. It's a super interesting book. It's full of twists and turns, and for people that like excitement and they think the Bible is something that's so dry, tell them to read the book of Esther, because you have it all. You have wild parties full of booze and alcohol and sex. It's there. You have unfaithful people and people who you would never expect to be outstanding citizens show some glimmer of hope. It's really fascinating. So the sermon series that we finished was Romans, and it was a micro approach to the book of Romans. Today we're taking a macro approach to the book of Esther, the big picture. What's it trying to say? So we're going to cover some things this morning. This is what we're going to cover, and I want you to jot this down in your notes. We're going to talk about the characters. Characters are important. We're going to talk about the context. So these are all C words. Character, context. Then we're going to talk about this thing called the chiasm. And really, I'm just going to tell you the story in my words. I'm not going to read all 10 chapters to you. That would take too long. But I'm going to paraphrase it for you. And after that, we're going to talk about the connections. The connections that we have to where we're at in life. So here's a brief overview of the characters. These are the ones that are really important. The first person you're introduced to when you turn to the book and you begin reading chapter 1 is King Xerxes. Some of your translations may have the name Ahasuerus. And that's the Hebrew word. Xerxes is the Greek name. So you got King Xerxes, and then you have the introduction of a Jewish guy named Mordecai. Mordecai is the cousin of the next character that you're introduced to, and this is the female character. Her Hebrew name is Hadassah. Esther is what the Greek reading would say, Esther. And then you have one other fellow that we need to mention because he plays an integral role in the book, and that's Haman. So you have King Xerxes, Mordecai, Esther, and Haman. 4 main characters in the book. Now, one very important character that is not found in the book of Esther is God. Never once is God mentioned. Never once is his name brought up in the entire book. Matter of fact, Esther also is one of the very few books that's never quoted in the New Testament. Now, if you do a lot of digging, you'll see that some rabbinic teachers say that there's some acrostics in there that institute the letters for Yahweh, so they force the name of God into the book, but it's just not there. So there's the characters, absent one important character. And here's the context. This is important to understand. What was the background? What were the people experiencing when this book was written? So most scholars agree that this book was probably written close to 100 years after the Babylonian captivity of the Jews. So let me give you a real quick history of the Jews. They experienced captivity from the Assyrian Empire, then the Babylonian Empire, and you can read about this in your history books, the Assyrian Empire, the Babylonian Empire, and then there's an empire that came to power known as the Medes and Persian Empire, and they were kind of lax, and they let the Jews go back home. And then you have the Greco-Roman Empire, who occupied the Holy Land, and that's where the New Testament takes place, during the Roman Empire. So at this particular point in the course of history, the Persian Empire is the dominant power, and the story takes place within that empire, and in particular, it takes place in the city of Susa. Now, just to give you an idea, this city of Susa is very close to the modern-day Iranian town of Shush. So that gives you an idea geographically of where this is taking place. King Xerxes is who's talked about in this whole book. He's the emperor, so to speak. He's the dominant, the political powerhouse. He was the son of Darius. You'll read about Darius in the Old Testament. He was also the grandson of Cyrus the Great. So here's what's important to note, and I've already mentioned it briefly. The Persians were much more lenient to those people that disagreed with their religious views. The Persians were pagan, but for the Jewish people, they were a little bit more lenient. They allowed them to practice some of their religious beliefs, much more so than the Babylonians. So when the Persians came to power, they were the ones that allowed the Jews to go back home. And they said, if you don't want to stay here, go back to Jerusalem, go back to the Holy Land. And a lot of them did. They returned. However, not all of them returned. Some chose to stay in Persia rather than to go back. So these Jews were the minority within the Persian Empire. So you have some Persians, and then you have a small group of Jewish people that are living there among those people. And like most minorities, these people experienced hardship and suffering, often for just simply being different. So there's the context. That's the setting through which you have to read this book through. Now I want to tell you the story. And this is where it's going to get, you're going to have to follow me really closely. I'm sorry. I don't know any other way to do this. The book is structured, I believe, in a chiasm. I've talked about this before. If you don't know what a chiasm is, it's a writing structure where the author would take point A1 and move to B1 and go to C1, and C1 may be the turning point, and then he would work his way back out and do B2, A2. Oftentimes, the most important part of the story is the middle, right? And it can go as long, it doesn't have to go A, B, C, it can go A, B, C, D, and then back out. It can be monstrous. This one's a fairly large chiasm, all 10 chapters. So here's how the story goes. It begins by talking about this Persian king's greatness. All right? So we're going to say Xerxes' greatness. That's where we start. The author, who we don't really know who it is, some speculate it's Mordecai, but the author tells us that Xerxes throws a party that lasts 6 months. 6 months long, 180 days. The king invites anybody who's somebody to this party. So what was happening is Xerxes was showing off everything that he had at his disposal. He was showing off his greatness, his grandeur. And most scholars believe that as this party was going on, Xerxes was probably putting himself up higher than everybody else on a throne and looking down on people, and people were looking up to him. So he was just trying to show everybody, look, I'm the head honcho, I've got it all. And here at this party, I'm telling you, this is why this book's so interesting. Here at this party, alcohol was plenteous, and they are living, absolutely smashed drunk for 6 months. And after this party that lasts for 6 months, that anybody who was somebody was invited to, that wasn't enough for Xerxes. He throws a 7-day party for the nobodies. So if you weren't anybody in the empire, you're a nobody. Hey, for 7 days, you're going to come and you can get plastered for 7 days. It was during this 6-month-long party that King Xerxes was probably highly intoxicated, and he makes a request out of the queen, Queen Vashti. We didn't talk about her as a main character, but she's in there. King Xerxes says, I want you to get Vashti and have her come to the party wearing nothing but her crown and parade her in front of everybody so they can gawk at her beauty. This is how the story goes. So, King Xerxes wants his queen to come walk around naked with nothing but the crown on just so people can look at her. And here's where I say some of those people that you wouldn't expect to see some good things out of, Vashti says, no, I'm not doing that. Not going to happen. And this infuriates the king. And because this is infuriating to the king, this is how we're introduced to Mordecai and Esther. King Xerxes disposes Vashti of her crown, and his advisors basically encourage him to have a beauty pageant to replace Queen Vashti. Among those that participate in the beauty pageant is Esther, the Jewish girl who was raised by her cousin Mordecai because her parents no longer were alive. She enters the beauty pageant. She finds favor with the people that are running the pageant. And essentially what happens to Esther is she's put on a fast track to get to the king. Now, it's a year-long process. They bring all these girls in and they put them through a process of preparing them, beautifying them for the king. It's a year-long process. Esther is pushed to the front of the pack. Long story short, Esther wins the beauty pageant. The king picks her. And like any good cousin who's playing the part of a father, Mordecai starts to hang out around the palace just outside the gates to keep a watchful eye on Esther. And one day, while he's hanging out by the gates, Mordecai hears a plan that's being developed by the gatekeepers to kill the king because the king did something to upset the gatekeepers. So Mordecai tells Esther, hey, you need to tip the king off, let him know that these guys are trying to kill him, they're not happy with him. So Esther tells the king, hey, they've got it out for you. And the plan's foiled. Nothing's ever done for Mordecai. All right? So that's the first portion of our chiasm. We get to the next portion of our chiasm, which is chapter 3a, and enters a man named Haman. And this is what we see. Haman is elevated. Now remember, Mordecai saves the king. Nothing happens. Haman enters the picture and he's elevated. Haman is said to be the king's right-hand man. Now Haman has a problem. It's called pride. He gets a big head because of the honor, and he demands that the people should pay him respect by bowing to him whenever he passes by. Now I want you to understand something here. When Haman says this, it would be the equivalent of our servicemen saluting a person of a higher rank. It doesn't have really anything to do with worship. It's just them being respectful. Haman demands their respect. He wants them to salute or bow when he walks by. Haman goes by Mordecai, and Mordecai says, no, I'm not going to bow to you, Haman. Now, I'll be honest with you. Nobody's really sure why Mordecai refuses to bow, because it's not worship that's taking place. Here's my suggestion. Mordecai knows that Haman, if you read the text, you'll find that Haman is called an Agagite. He's not Persian, he's Agagite. An Agagite is a direct descendant of the Canaanites. And I have a feeling that old Mordecai knew that Haman was a Canaanite, and Mordecai says, this Jew is not bowing down to a Canaanite. You know, we solved that problem a long time ago. We kicked you out, right? Or we were supposed to. So Haman becomes infuriated with Mordecai. And what happens is Haman is told that Mordecai is a Jew. Okay? So we enter into the next phase of our chiasm. And it involves Haman again. Haman decrees to kill all Jews. Now, this is not just Mordecai. He says, forget just Mordecai, I'm going to kill them all. I want to annihilate all the Jews. He's so angry. He has anger issues. You'll figure Haman is a guy. I relate to Haman, believe it or not, because I can put myself in his position. He has anger issues. Haman goes to the king. And Haman and the king do what they do best. They get drunk. And Haman says, hey, I want you to make a decree that says we're going to kill all these Jewish people. And the king, sloshed, says, not a problem, writes the decree. So we enter into the next phase of our chiasm. And this, I don't have room to write this, but you can write it down. Mordecai persuades Esther to help. That's Mordecai and Esther get together. Maybe I can abbreviate it. And we're going to put Morty and Esther plan. How's that? Morty and Esther make a plan. Now Mordecai, he becomes concerned about his Jewish brethren and sisters. Now if I put myself in Mordecai's position, I would probably be concerned too, because he's the reason that they are experiencing this problem, right? Because of his unwillingness to just show some respect. He realizes that this is all my fault, and I got to do something about it. So I want to interject something here. Perhaps for the first time in the story, Mordecai stops thinking about himself and he starts thinking about other people for the first time. So Mordecai goes and he enlists the help of Esther. Why? Because she can possibly have access to the king. Now here's the catch. It could be deadly for her, because if she's not summoned by the king, she can't go to the king. And she says this. She says, Mordecai, listen, it's not as easy as you think. If I go in there and he doesn't summon me, he can kill me. So Mordecai tells Esther this in chapter 4:14b, and who knows that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this? Who knows if you have come to your position in such a time as this? Now again, you would think that Mordecai might have said, hey, I think God put you here for this very reason, but he didn't say that. Who knows? Maybe, just maybe, you're here for this very reason. So Esther responds with, I believe, what may be the only religious implication in the entire book. She asks Mordecai to have all the Jews fast for 3 days, and then she will approach the king and she says this, if I perish, I perish. Now, notice she doesn't say have them fast and pray. She doesn't have them fast and seek God. She just says have them fast. So that's why I say maybe a religious implication. And then we move further into our story where Esther has her first banquet. So Esther's first banquet. Now this is interesting to me. Queen comes into Esther. She says, I really need to talk to you. He doesn't kill her because he extends the scepter. She comes in. She's like, I got a problem and I need to ask you something. He says, I'll give you anything you want, up to half the kingdom. Tell me what it is, Esther, because, he loves her. And Esther says, well, I want you to come to a banquet that I've prepared for you tomorrow. And I want you to bring Haman with you. So the king and Haman show up to the banquet. And they eat and they probably get drunk. And the king asks Esther again, what is the request that you have? And Esther, I don't really know what she was doing. She backpedals maybe a little bit. She has some hesitation. I want you to come back tomorrow for another banquet. And so she doesn't tell the king, what she wants. She says, I want you to come back tomorrow for another banquet. And as Haman is leaving the banquet, he sees Mordecai. And when he sees Mordecai, he's filled with hate again at his sight. And Haman goes home, and he tells his family about his deep hate for Mordecai, and they say, hey, why don't you just build this big tall pole? And in the morning when you go back to talk to the king, just ask him if you can impale Mordecai on the pole. So it seems like things may be going from bad to worse for Mordecai and the Jews. But we're getting to chapter 6. And this is the pivotal moment of the story. This is the center of the chiasm. The night before the first banquet, or the night after the first banquet and before the second banquet we're going to get to, King Xerxes has a hard time going to sleep. How many of you have been there? You just lay and you got everything going through your head. So the king asked his attendant, he said, why don't you bring in the royal chronicles and read to me, like a bedtime story. Read me a bedtime story to help me go to sleep. And providentially, the book is open to the account of Mordecai uncovering a plan to kill King Xerxes. And as the story is read, Xerxes asked his attendant, did we ever do anything for Mordecai for saving my life? And the king's attendant affirmed that nothing had ever been done for Mordecai. And this is my favorite part of the whole story. This tells you how sick I can be. The next morning, when the king gets out of bed, Haman comes strolling into the palace. He's on cloud 9 because he's so powerful. He'd been invited to 2 banquets with the king and the queen, and he was getting ready to just ask the king, just let me put Mordecai on that pole and get him out of my sight for good. And he's strolling in, just ready to get the king's permission. And before Haman can say a word, the king says, Haman, what would you do for a man that the king honors? And I can just see Haman saying, oh boy, he's talking about me. And Haman lays out this lavish plan. And the dagger to Haman was, Haman, you go get Mordecai and do exactly what you said. So can you imagine Haman walking through the city with Mordecai, who he hates, on the king's horse, wearing the king's robe, saying, look what the king does for the man who has honored him. So that's the pivot. Now we get to the upswing, and we get to Esther's second banquet. And it gets even better. Now imagine being Haman and being humiliated, but perhaps there's a glimmer of hope because I still get to go to the second banquet with Esther. Haman and the king arrive at the second banquet, and here another twist is revealed. As they're drinking and being merry and eating, Esther informs the king, hey, honey, I just feel like this is the appropriate time to let you know that I'm Jewish. Not only am I Jewish, but Mordecai, he's Jewish too. And you made a decree that all the Jews needed to be killed, which includes myself and Mordecai. And the king, I'm sure he had a few drinks. Who's responsible for this? I can't remember. Esther says, Haman. And the king leaves the room furious. And Haman knows he has no chance with the king, so he stays behind to talk to Esther and beg and plead for his life. Please spare me. And the king goes out, and he's probably hitting some shots because he just can't handle it anymore. He walks back into the room, and as he's walking into the room, it just so happens that Haman has fallen on top of Esther to beg for his life, and the king says, not only does he want to kill my wife, he's going to molest her in my presence. And somebody says, hey, Haman just put up a pole that he was going to put Mordecai on. Why don't you put Haman on the pole? And the king says, done. And Haman is hung on the pole that was meant for Mordecai. What an interesting twist in the story. So we move to the next phase. And you know what it is? It's a reflection of what we see over here. Old Morty and Esther plan. They plan again. Esther goes to the king. She says, you got to reverse this decree. You got to stop it. The king says, yeah, but according to Persian custom, once I issue a decree, it cannot be overturned. It cannot be reversed. But old Mordecai steps up, and the king's happy with Mordecai because he saved his life. We move to the next part. Mordecai is permitted to write another decree on behalf of the king. So here we get Morty's decree. Now notice, Haman decrees, Morty decrees. Notice the mirror image here. So Mordecai tells the king, I'm going to write this decree. I'm going to give permission for all the Jews to assemble together and protect themselves. If anybody were to try to attack them, the king says, hey, do one even better than that. Tell them that they can protect themselves. Tell them they can plunder whoever tries to attack them. When you read the story, you'll find out that the Jews protect themselves, but they don't plunder anybody. And then in this decree, Mordecai says, hey, and it's our turn to celebrate now. We're the minority, but this is a happy day for us, so you should feast, you should celebrate because we've been given this opportunity. And then we move into the next part of the story where Mordecai is elevated. Morty is elevated. Mordecai is given a position of prominence. Mordecai becomes the king's right-hand man. Mordecai is given access to the king, and he takes the place of Haman. And then chapters 9 and 10 tell about Morty's greatness rather than Xerxes' greatness. The day comes for the Jews to protect themselves, and they do. The Jewish people are spared. Mordecai is honored for his act of stepping up to save the Jewish people. He's commended, and a feast is instituted. You can read all about this feast. It's called the Feast of Purim. It's still celebrated by Jewish people to this day. They gather to celebrate and remember their deliverance that was brought through Mordecai. Interesting story. So, how does it connect to us? Why is it included in here? Well, here's something I want you to write down. God's obscurity does not equal God's absence. God's obscurity does not equal God's absence. Though God is not mentioned specifically in the book, God's fingerprint to spare, notice here, it has nothing to do with Esther or Mordecai, really. God's fingerprints to spare the Jewish people can be seen all over the place. Right? When you look at the pivotal moment in chapter 6, this is the only time that we don't see Mordecai or Esther trying to do anything. We see the providence of God at work. It just so happens that the king can't sleep. It just so happens that the chronicle that's read is about Mordecai saving the king's life. But you see, Mordecai didn't tell him what to read. Esther didn't tell him what to read. Esther didn't cause the king not to sleep. This is where the author, I really believe, wants us to look deep into the text and search for God. In the midst of the mess and the sloppiness of the story, this is where the author says, look for God, seek him, find him. This is where he's at. This is God moving and God working. But I do think, understanding that God's obscurity does not equal his absence, I do think that one of the questions we need to wrestle with is, why is it that God is never specifically mentioned? And here's what I want to put forth to you. God's absence may be due to the condition of his people illustrated through Esther and Mordecai. When I first started reading this, I've been reading this story for months, and I felt like God said, hey, let's talk about this. Let's tell the people about this. I said, okay, let's do that. And when I first started reading this story, the title of the sermon was going to be How to Be Mordecai in a World Full of Hamans. But notice I've changed the title of the sermon to Divine Design. Listen, Esther and Mordecai really aren't the greatest examples of faithful, moral people. And I think it's a shame that some people who communicate this message try to make them look like something they're not. Here's why I say that. Esther breaks the Jewish law instituted by God by marrying a Gentile. It really doesn't seem to be implied that she participated in this beauty pageant begrudgingly. It more like appears that she voluntarily steps in to take place in this beauty pageant. When you read the text carefully, you'll see that it involves a sleepover. So the king's going to try the goods before he makes a commitment. You'll also find that she hides her identity as a Jew. She does this because Mordecai encourages her, don't tell anybody that you're Jewish. All right? Now here's another problem. Mordecai does not return to the Holy Land when he's allowed to go. He stayed in Persia. Well, that's any good Jewish person is going to go back to the Holy Land. Why? Because that's the land that God promised him. Well, he didn't do that. See, Mordecai really does what's advantageous to promote himself. He hides being Jewish when it's a benefit, but he tells others about being Jewish when it gives him satisfaction. So in chapter 2, verses 10 and 20, you'll see that they make careful note. Esther had not revealed her nationality and family background because Mordecai had forbidden her to do so. And then again in verse 20. But Esther had kept secret her family background and nationality just as Mordecai had told her to do. All right? And then you get to chapter 3, verse 4, and this is what you find. This is when Haman finds out that Mordecai is a Jew. Day after day they spoke to him, but he refused to comply. Therefore they told Haman about it to see whether Mordecai's behavior would be tolerated, for he told them he was a Jew. How did they know he was? He told them. Well, why did he tell them? Because he was using it as an excuse. That's why I'm not bowing down to Haman, because it's advantageous for me. I don't like Haman, so I'm just going to use my Jewish position to justify why I'm not doing what he's asked me to do. If you go over to verse 8, this is what's fascinating to me. Then Haman said to King Xerxes, "There is a certain people dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom who keep themselves separate." Now notice how Haman recognized these people. They kept themselves separate. He says their customs are different from those of all the other people, and they do not obey the king's laws. It is not in the king's best interest to tolerate them. Now Haman knows these people by their lifestyle. He only knows Haman's Jewish he only knows Mordecai's Jewish because Mordecai told him. He didn't know Mordecai was Jew because of the way Mordecai lived. He only knew it because Mordecai said, "I'm Jewish." The other people, on the other hand, those out there that are living in the rural areas, he knows they're Jewish because of the way they conduct themselves. See, there's a big difference between those people and Mordecai. And when we understand this position that Esther and Mordecai really aren't upstanding people when it comes to being faithful, this is the biggest thing I think we can take away from the whole story. God uses broken people to move forward his perfect plan of redemption and restoration. I think you should write that down. God uses broken people to move forward his plan of redemption and restoration. One commentator wrote this: "The book implies that even when God's people are far from him and disobedient, they are still the object of his concern and love, and that he is working out his purposes through them." You know, this sermon comes right on the heels of Romans, where we read in Romans chapter 8, verse 28, and I think this is the lens through which we have to read the book of Esther. "And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose." See, here's what Mordecai and Esther were doing. Mordecai and Esther had to wrestle with living out their faith as a minority. They weren't the in crowd. And where this connects to us is we have to be willing to wrestle with what living out our faith looks like as a minority. Because we are living in a society that's becoming more and more increasingly hostile to God. We are living within a society that is continuing and moving forward, their prerogative forward, to call good evil and evil good. Now here's what's fascinating about Mordecai and Esther. Mordecai and Esther often used the Persian culture as a way of advancing themselves rather than using God's way. They bought into the system. She joined the beauty pageant. He encouraged her to do it. But God still used them. You know, I can't help but ask, how much different would the story have been had they been more faithful? Perhaps if they had been more faithful, we might find the name of God and the presence of God mentioned specifically. So, for us, something we can take away from this book is that even in those times in our lives when God seems to be absent, we can rest assured that though he may be hidden, that doesn't mean he's not there. Just like the mountain that I saw on vacation. Even though it was covered with the clouds, I knew that it was there. And later in the day, when the clouds went away and the sun came out, guess what? I wasn't wrong. It was there. God is working even when we can't see him to bring about his purpose. And the book of Esther helps us understand that despite our brokenness, despite the sloppiness that we sometimes experience in our life, his plan continues to unfold. So when we overlay that to where we are in our current situation, it really doesn't matter how bad the pandemic gets. It really doesn't matter, and I may be run out of town for saying this, it really doesn't matter who wins the election, because God is always in control. And I heard that, yes it does. No, it really doesn't. Because whoever wins, that's God's providence. That's God's providence. And God can use even broken people to move forward his plan and his purpose that's never failing. And that's what I choose to stand on. In the midst of this pain, in the midst of this confusion, I trust that God is moving his plan forward. Despite how broken I am. Let's pray. God, there are certainly times in our lives that we fail to see you, that we fail to feel your presence. But that does not change the fact that you are always there. This is what you show us in this book. In this book that you are never mentioned, you would have it be a part of your revelation of who you are. Because you teach us that when we look intently, when we look with purpose, we will find you. God, I choose to trust you in this moment. I pray that every one of us would make that decision every day of our lives and realize it's just not a one-time thing. We have to wake up every day and make the decision, today I'm trusting you. In the next moment, I'm trusting you. And I know in those times when we desperately need to feel you and see you, I know that you're faithful and you will reveal yourself in your perfect timing. God, in the uncertainty and in the unclarity, help us to put all of our faith in you alone. May we be like the people that were recognized by being different, being separate from the culture that surrounded them. And I pray these things in your Son, Jesus' name. Amen.